All right. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I have to do this in English. My Icelandic isn't good enough. Right. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's the first time I'm in Iceland. I should have stayed longer, but well, my wife is pregnant again, and we have still 2 small kids, so I have to go back tomorrow, unfortunately. But we'll be back with the family, I'm sure. I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here to share, well, recent thinking on strategic environmental assessment with you. Before I start, can I ask who has actually been involved in, well, preparing or contributing to strategic environmental assessment? Good, good. Well, I have to ask that question. Good. So, yes, it's not a lecture. I was asked for the title, and I said if we didn't think we were going to change the world, we wouldn't be here. That's at the heart of strategic environmental assessment, I believe, so that's why I chose the title. To start with, I don't know, some of you may have been there. In 2001, I was working at an institute near Berlin, and we had a group of you coming over, and I wrote a little article, and I retrieved this. So there have been some early links from over 15 years ago. And reading it, because when I prepared this presentation here today, I thought, gosh, I have to be careful. Your country is so different from what I'm used to in terms of countries working in. Sparsely populated, obviously, quite large. But then, when I saw what I wrote here 15 years ago, it says that everyone involved in the discussions was surprised that problems were perceived in a very similar way. So maybe, well, I'll see what you say. You can shout at me if you disagree with me. Okay. Then to start with, it's not rocket science, no, it's far more complicated than that. When we say it's not rocket science, we mean it's something far more complicated. And in a way it is. Rocket science is quite straightforward. There are rules, there are equations you use, and, well, you apply them. A few very simple things to start with. Good things happen when you set your priorities straight. The key is not to prioritize what's on your schedule, but to schedule your priorities. And you can do anything but not everything. That's really important, really, when you start thinking about strategic environmental assessment. And those kinds of very fundamental and simple starting points are almost more important than what you do in terms of procedure, techniques, methods you apply, whatever. So what is it about? It's about asking why, what, how, where, and when. And it's about common sense. And therefore it's more complicated than rocket science, because common sense is very hard to get by. And also what is quite important, I mean, our thinking has advanced. And the environment is really only one aspect. The philosophy behind strategic environmental assessment, in terms of asking questions, why do we want to do something? What is it we want to do? How, where, and when? That obviously goes beyond purely the environment. Strategic environmental assessment very often has a long-term horizon. Okay, let's go back to the 50s. Well, I wasn't born then, but anyway. If someone from the 1950s suddenly appeared today, what would be the most difficult thing to explain? I have a device in my pocket capable of accessing the entirety of human knowledge. I use it to argue with strangers and look at pictures of cats. To predict things is not an easy thing. So we do work with time horizons easily of, well, 30, 40, 50 years. It's an impossibility to know exactly what will happen. However, that doesn't mean you just go ahead and don't think about it. So another quote or cartoon here. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. That's at the heart of SEA as well. Being preoccupied with, oh, we need to do something, but not stopping to think if you actually should, reflecting on past experiences. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Just because we've always done something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. Once we know better, we can choose better. And I mean, recent history has had numerous episodes, globally, in my countries, in your country. And that's the starting point for strategic environmental assessment, just a few quotes. Okay. So, what is it? If I asked that question in the UK, we had a conference in the UK on strategic environmental assessment last year in Oxford, on strategic environmental assessment, yes. And about 100 participants, 70% consultants, and if I asked the question to someone I didn't really know, the reply would have been, oh, it's a process. It's a loop to go through to get development consent. And that frustrates me. I started off working in practice, so I haven't been an academic my whole life. I worked as a consultant at the beginning of my career, and then I worked for government for a while, and then I started a PhD. And what I'm doing now is well, a range of things, but it's also consultancy. So it's not like I'm sort of, this would be an academic perspective. It's an easy way to shut an academic up, to tell him, oh yeah, but that's an academic point of view. So, initially SEA was really thought of purely in terms of, well, project environmental impact assessment principles applied to what we usually refer to, even though there are other words or other terms, policies, plans and programs, or PPPs, not to be confused with public-private partnerships. Subsequently, different interpretations emerged, and I also get frustrated when I go to workshops and somebody is introducing strategic environmental assessment, and then I sit there and think, this is almost like being in a time warp. It's what we thought 20 years ago. It's not what we think now. So, so things have advanced quite substantially since it first started. So in terms of why SEA, and SEA is a lot more complicated than EIA, but anyway, why it's different. It's usually different geographical and time scales. The time scales, that little quote there in terms of what would you, or how would you explain an iPhone to someone from the 1950s. Different levels of detail, of course, in terms of what we know and how we approach things at strategic and project levels. And then different ways in which strategic decision processes are usually organized, even though they can also be quite, well, heavily organized, structured as an administrative process, and we shouldn't forget that. This is a definition I came up with a few years ago. It contains three parts. One is it revolves around a process. So it's well, what we started when we started thinking on strategic environmental assessment, going back to the environmental impact assessment process. then it's about an instrument that is trying to add scientific rigor to decision-making, and that is still important. We've gone through various periods of development of strategic environmental assessment. And at the time when you visited Berlin, over 15 years ago, we lived in an era of the so-called postmodern paradigm, where people said process is everything. We're not interested in outcomes. But I mean, we are beyond that. Process is important, but it's also about outcomes. And outcomes that, well, are influenced by scientific rigor, and that's quite important. And then, and that's what I'm going to focus about a bit more today, it's actually a decision-making framework which should help to establish a substantive focus when you take decisions at particular levels. In particular, in terms of the alternatives that you may consider in assessment. Yes. Very often, as I said before, when you ask somebody what is SEA, they would say that, oh, it's a process. But as I say, it's more than that, and that is really important. Okay, SEA, strategic environmental assessment. What is strategy? It's a solution for moving from where you are now to where you want to be. I mean, the important thing is, of course, to know where you want to be, which sometimes we don't really know. And I mean, I'm not saying we always need to know or should know. Sometimes it's impossible. But of course, we should at least try to think about where we want to be. And what you want to happen to achieve an end. Well, the end of where you ideally would like to be. So, and a lot of confusion starts here. Well, when you look at this slide. A lot of people think in terms of what strategic is, in terms of the upper 2 bullet points here, goals and aims and policies, that's it. Strategic thinking is all this together. Goals, development of goals and aims, where do you want to be, the policies to achieve them, and then the plans, the programs to implement them, and then finally the projects. You really need to consider it all together, otherwise you're not thinking strategically. And I think, well, we had some fierce debate in the past, and it makes me, well, uncomfortable when I still hear people saying, oh, the only real strategic level here is the policy level. I disagree fundamentally with that. So, focusing only on these upper tiers isn't strategic. It means looking at all tiers, not just the top level of decision making. Okay, so if we, for a moment, just consider the top levels, what is frequently happening? It's something like this. And I mean, here strategy, as I say, is used in that slightly dodgy way. But anyway, it just supports my point, so I've put that in. 10 minutes left. Let's do the strategy. I've just, yesterday, I came here from Stockholm. I'm in advisory board for what is currently the biggest environmental assessment research project in Europe, so-called SPEAK project. It's about €1 million, which is a huge research project for environmental assessment. And I've been there now 5 times, so the project has been running a couple of years. And it's fascinating to hear experience. It's a systematic evaluation of existing both SEA and EIA practices in Sweden. And yesterday we had a discussion, and it was exactly about sort of this whole framework idea. And Lotta Feidel, she then said, yeah, we had a similar situation. So they're thinking about putting in high-speed rail in Sweden. But then at one point, somebody asked why. And everyone was stunned. There was silence, because no one had thought about the why. A lot of what we do is based on assumptions, but I mean, it's still a good question why. Because maybe, if we know why we want it, maybe there's actually a better solution to the problem. Who knows? I mean, maybe not. No one initially asked why. And then I asked her, well, so this person asked the why question. Didn't everyone get really annoyed? Yes. And the meeting became very acrimonial. But she said, actually, then after the meeting, a couple of days later, those people that were shouting the loudest, they actually came back and said, okay, let's think about this. And that's very often what happens, of course. I mean, it also requires some patience if you sort of try to do something like this and question things. The same in the country I live in, the UK, Thames Estuary Airport, you may have heard of that huge airport. People had ideas to build an airport in the Thames Estuary for a century now. It was always rejected, mainly because it's a main area for migratory birds. What's the worst thing for aviation? It's bird strike. So it's utterly unsuitable. Apart from being in the wrong part of the country, the infrastructure wouldn't be there, and so on and so on. So what it is, it's a prestige project for Sir Norman Foster, and it's supported by, oh shit, I got the name wrong. Anyway, he is our Donald Trump, Boris Johnson. He is. And actually, I mean, this is obviously presented as a joke, but when we deal with SCA or environmental assessment as well, to be aware of trends in society is extremely important. We are at an age now where sort of we witness a very populist trend, and I mean, I think it's worrying. I know where it's coming from. I remember the 1990s. People were talking about globalization, internationalization. What did the politicians tell us? Oh, I'm sorry, we can't do anything for you because it's out of our control. This is where it comes from. Back then I was thinking, this will come back to bite you, and this is what's happening now. This populism comes from that era, because now they say, oh, we can change everything. And of course, in a way, they think they sort of repeat what the, I don't know what the right word is. The normal person, that's already Jürgen Klopp. I don't know if anyone follows football of you, but anyway. I come back to that. You can ask me during the break. Anyway, and the environment at the moment in many countries has really slipped quite a bit of the agenda. So in this case, even though SCA is more than about the environment, it's important. Well, it's an important aspect. So, what is SCA? First and foremost, it's about an ability to take a step back and think, or look at an idea with hopefully, well, fresh eyes. In this context, SCA functions as a critical friend. What is a critical friend? Well, a critical friend helps you see your strengths, wants to help actually, wants to help you move forward, can change mind, so through learning in particular, through process, and hopefully can make you smile. So it's different from critics, and when you reflect on experiences you possibly may have had, but that I have had with SCA and, for example, public meetings, or working with authorities, or certain authorities, it looks more like here, what is on the left. Will make you swear, will change your mood into a bad mood, of course. Well, anyway, so it's supposed to function really as a critical friend, not to stop things per se. It's supposed to be constructive. It's supposed to help you think outside the box, which is very difficult. And I mean, I know that from my own life. On second thought, why don't we just stay here in the box where it's safe? I mean, and that's human nature, and it's my nature as well. I know that. But this is what makes SCA difficult, because it's supposed to help you think outside the box. So it's a real challenge. So that little cartoon from the start, it's not rocket science, it's a lot more complicated. There's something to it. I'm not going to focus too much on this here. This is just sort of showing sort of a gradual changing focus from sort of very visionary, policy-oriented considerations to concrete project considerations. There's no clear dividing line here between SEA and EIA. It's gradual. There's a gradual shift from between what we call policies, plans, and programs. As I say, different terms are used. Plans, it can be different types of plans. For example, let's reflect on transport planning. It may be that you generate, if you focus on the infrastructure of a country, for example, on the whole network, that would be a network plan. Then if you want to improve connections between two places based on previous considerations or based on, well, ideas that a lot of people have, it may be something like a corridor plan. So, of course, this is flexible, and this is just sort of an indication how it works. But of course, it goes from conceptual to operational, from general to detail. And so this is how it works, and it works together in a strategic way. And I actually have to get rid here of the strategic. This is something that you find in every book on SEA, in the literature, because as I say, I think the strategic is all of this together and shouldn't just be there at the top left corner of it. With this gradual change, there's change in terms of the methods that you may apply, there's changes in terms of, well, the role of practitioners, maybe more acting as a mediator when we talk about, well, why do we want to do something? Are there any other options at the very basic level? And later, more as an advocate of established values and norms, and then as a technician using stakeholder values. Of course, the further you go towards sort of policy, visionary considerations, it's more vague, more distant, and at the project level, it's really more reactive. NIMBY, not in my backyard. You find a lot of attitudes like this, and they're not negative. Sometimes NIMBYism is portrayed as something negative. Again, it's human nature. You just don't want a dual carriageway next to your house. That's normal. There's nothing negative about it, but it means you're dealing with something different when you run through a process. What is also important is that SEA is applied in a wide range of different situations, and therefore it takes very different formats. Trade agreements, funding programs, economic development plans, and then sort of more traditionally maybe spatial or land use plans, and then sectoral plans, transport, energy, waste, water, whatever it is, policies, plans, and programs. Yes, best known framework law, of course, is the European Directive. We had a meeting in Brussels two and a half weeks ago on experiences with applying the directive, because the Commission at the moment is now starting a process of well, renewing it, amending it. Most of the applications that we have at the moment are only partially really SEA, because they focus on isolated plans and programs and then don't take sort of a more systems view or framework view, looking at different levels, for example. I'll come back to this in a second. Generally speaking, the need for SEA results from the need for a stronger representation of strategic environmental assessment in policy, plan, program, and project making. This is why the fourth P is bold. The need for more effective reasoning in decision-making. And it's not a hierarchy. You never go, well, I've never been to a system where you start with a blank sheet of paper, of course not. So it's something like this here, circular reasoning. So it goes backwards and forward. What am I doing? It goes backwards and forwards. It goes top down and bottom up. Ultimately, it is about more efficient decision-making, because if you don't ask why questions at the beginning, people will ask that question somewhere down the line when you've already spent a lot of time and effort into creating something. And that you see again and again as well. Well, It's about sustainable development, even though sustainable development, in the sense of the 1990s, at least in the UK, the current government, if they use sustainable development, what they mean is continued economic growth. I mean, it really has been streamlined in that way. Right, so principles of SEA. So Project EIA is a part of that, as I see it. So we have a nice environmental assessment tree. What happened? Well, this is very often what happens. You prepare policies, plans, and programs, and somehow the connection with actual implementation, it becomes interrupted and difficult to map out and whatever. And I see this as really the biggest problem. So, and currently, we have isolated, I call them isolated SEAs or EIAs, prepared for here policies, plans, programs, and I should have drawn, well, I should have underlined several times because of course it's different policies, plans and programs very often, and then projects. The connection between SEA and EIA often remains a question mark. An anecdote that I have told several times. 1990s, the Netherlands, they were really at the forefront of strategic thinking in a number of ways, spatial planning, transport planning. They had what they called the National Transport Structure Plan, and they had regional structure plans, and they had integrated assessments, very sophisticated. When you can find the document, Second Transport Structure Plan from 1990, the document itself included a policy part with a policy appraisal of different options, and then also a project part where projects were presented. It was something that was really, as I say, quite innovative and well, of great interest to me as a researcher. Studying all of this, at one point I had a problem. I couldn't get the policy part together with the projects. So there was a conference in The Hague, and there was a guy from the Transport Ministry who was, well, leading on the preparation of that transport structure plan. And I asked him, I think you're doing a brilliant job, but can you explain to me how actually the policy part relates or connects with the project part? And there was a silence for 3 seconds. And he said, well, you spotted the weakness in one document. And that's very often what's happening. But I mean, why are we then doing policy in the first place if we find it impossible to connect it with the projects that follow on? When you read about SEA, a lot of publications over the last few years have said, oh, we need to think in terms of a real strategic approach to strategic environmental assessment. And what they mean here is focusing on policies. As I say, this is important in order to avoid this. So that reflects what I just said, that little anecdote, the story. You have plans or policies or whatever it is, and you have implementation. The two don't really fit, and that creates a problem. In this case, actually, it creates the problem that the stupid car isn't driving or won't be driving. So, going back to the principles then. And going back, as I said at the beginning, I'm going to focus on this a bit more than on other things here, because I think it's really essential and at the heart of developing effective environmental or strategic environmental assessment. A generic framework that can guide decision makers in systematically addressing why and what questions, what and where and how questions and where and when questions is essential. This is from a project I'm doing for the International Atomic Agency. They want guidelines for nuclear power programs. But they're very, very open to well, me in this case as a consultant, I accept they want guidelines for national power programs. It's what you have here in gray. I sort of drew a pyramid, which doesn't mean it's top down. It just means you usually have fewer energy policies than you actually have projects. That's what this indicates. So they want guidelines for nuclear power programs. That's one part in the decision, what we refer to often hierarchy, but as I say, it's not seen as a top-down thing. From energy policy to strategies to programs and plans, and then to actual projects. And within that guidance, I sort of will include something like this at the start to make very clear, well, this is what it's focusing on, so it's not focusing on everything. Because also sometimes people think, we do a strategic environmental assessment, we'll have covered all the ground. Well, it depends on how you do it. And it's not just about energy either. This is why I included here the second figure. Of course, there are connections with transport and also spatial planning. How close do you have a nuclear power plant, for example, to a major city? Well, what are the implications in terms of transport? So it is really complex. Again, taking this as an example, and looking at the different interpretations, you could say, well, this school that says, oh, we need to be really strategic, is really only focusing on this, so they wouldn't be bothered at all with those nuclear power programs. In practice, most people focus on this, on specific and sort of isolated plans or programs, and then sort of go ahead and do something, without necessarily... Well, in Sweden, it seems like they really always ask the questions, where have we addressed other questions, which is really good. But in many countries, they would just focus on questions that are relevant at that particular level of decision making. And when I started as a practitioner, to give you an example, I started working on roads. And we had public hearings, and then it was about a new bypass, and then people asking questions like, do we really need this bypass? Well, have we thought about extending the tram that we have? And what did my boss say? Because, I mean, I was working for the Transport Ministry. He said, this is nothing to be discussed here. And then people said, where is it discussed? Well, you have to ask your whatever, city and town. So it's tricky. So obviously it was something that wasn't really discussed somewhere else. And this is why this approach here, and this is what I call School 3, sort of the framework approach, is so important, to really be aware, at least, of what's happening elsewhere, and to ask the questions, well, have we looked at why we are doing this? Have we looked at alternatives that we may have had prior to starting this? So that's a key issue. Yes, and I included this little effect here. It isn't to be seen as a hierarchy. It works top-down and bottom-up. In reality, you may plan projects that come out of, in a way, nowhere. And that's fine, because it's the way things work in reality. But you will still need to ask the question, well, what is it we did somewhere else? So it's about this here, the whole hierarchy to consider. Okay. You can apply that in different ways. I'm not going to read all of this out, but this is just an example. If you look at it as a framework, and if you look at it as sort of as a support tool to help you ask the right questions at the right time, this is a framework for transport planning I developed quite a few years ago now. I just included this here. So, and that was based on transport planning practices in the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany that I had researched quite extensively at the time. And I found a lot of similarities. And in the three countries, I found that the focus tended to be on different levels here, but usually not really on all of it together. So in Germany, the National Transport Infrastructure Plan was in effect a program, so starting very late. And everything else was somehow nebulous. what was happening. In the Netherlands, I already mentioned the transport structure plan was really at the bottom, at the top level, and then it went straight to the project level, but somehow there was something missing in between. In the UK, that was slightly more complex. But anyway, so I developed that on the basis of the evidence that I received. So if you take the framework idea and have a clear idea, well, what is it we need to ask? What are the questions we need to ask? What are the tasks in this context then we need to address? You can really come up with something like this. Systematic decision tier, the focus of, well, the questions you are asking, the tasks you need to fulfill, the types of impact to consider, and the role different administrative levels may have. That's of course simplistic, but it helps. Now the next slide here. Whenever I'm asked to lecture, actually, I wasn't asked to lecture here on SEA. Whenever I'm asked to lecture on SEA to practitioners or to ministries, I ask, okay, I give you half an hour, sit down and come up with a graph showing how transport planning or transport policy plan, program, project making works in your country. I first did that at a conference in Panama, a conference of ministries for transport of Latin American countries. And we had representatives of ministries from about 10 countries present. Every single person after half an hour came back with a blank sheet. They didn't know how transport planning worked. So what I do when I have, in particular, PhD students very often have the idea, Thomas, I want to come up with the ideal SEA framework for whatever country, Pakistan, China. I said, good. First, tell me what is already done in your country in terms of assessment, in terms of, well, transport planning, what issues are addressed where. Yeah, no problem, I do that. Okay, 2 weeks? No, I come back in a couple of days. And then I don't hear again for about 6 months. As I say, this may be different in your country. I don't know. But most countries I've been dealing with, people are really struggling to show how it works. Now, strategic environmental assessment, of course, it is applied to something that already exists. It doesn't come and is separate from everything. It's supposed to help us think in the current setup of things. So in the absence of a clear understanding what we already have, it can't do anything. This was from a student of mine from Brazil, and it took her 4 months to do this. So this is Brazil, national level, state level at the metropolitan region and municipal level, and then the different sort of, systematic tiers, as we call it, policies, plans, and programs. And she then came up with 2 or 3 of these things. And that's based on that framework idea, and she found that incredibly hard. But that enabled her at the end of the day, because what she was interested in was to show how SEA could be applied at the metropolitan level, and she was able to do that quite neatly on the basis of knowing what's actually happening. You often get guidance where people say, this is what you have to do. Well, that's all fine, but isn't this what we already do here and that what we do there? So to sit down and come up with something like that, it can take different formats. That's an example. Many years ago, again, I did for Germany. And what I was interested in, well, where's assessment happening at the different levels? White means no assessment. Light grey, and you can hardly see this actually on this slide, but anyway, I mean some assessment and systematic assessment. And the systematic assessment here in Germany was all towards sort of the bottom end, really starting quite late. You can use this in different sectors. That's an example for the energy sector. And you can also use this in a way, there may be controversial issues like nuclear energy, right? And a country deciding to go forward with nuclear energy, that's a fundamental political decision. Once you have taken that decision on whatever basis, you start on the assumption that, yes, we will use nuclear energy in our mix. That's a very tricky step already. But then, of course, you apply then SEA on that basis. You don't, well, and this is an example, so it's an example from Scottish Power. They were thinking, they are responsible for the grid for the electricity grid in not just Scotland but all of northern England. And they said, how can SEA help us to structure decision making by planning the grid? So not focusing on the sources. That was a different decision, and it's worth then looking at that as well. But so that framework can be used also in a very specific situation. You're still asking why, what, how, when, and where. And I mean, I understand that this may be of some relevance in Iceland at the moment, of course. If you go for renewables like wind energy, for example, you have different demands on the grid than when you have a nuclear power plant that generates energy for 5 million people. Well, okay, in your case, it wouldn't be for 5 million people. But of course, that is a totally different grid that you then have. It's more micro sort of generation of energy if you have wind energy rather than sort of, a combined power plant that may generate energy for millions of people. And yes, it's also about the process, and I just wanted to say that, just to ensure you, if you are then in a specific policy plan and program situations, of course you apply a process, ideally in parallel to the plan making or program making process. And I don't need to go into detail here. This is why I asked the question at the beginning, who has been involved in strategic environmental assessment. But well, I leave it to you to ponder on this, but it's of high relevance for strategic environmental assessment, of course. I love this cartoon. I think my time is nearly up. I had sort of slides, but I thought I wouldn't really focus on those. I have them here, so I'm happy. It's sort of just slides showing what different approaches there may be to do strategic environmental assessment. There's at least 50 different approaches in methodological terms to do it. Just very quickly, this is what most of you will be aware of. That's sort of this typical matrix approach, a qualitative assessment based on objectives, where you look at different parts, for example, of a plan or program, and you then look at, well, is that, do the proposed measures meet my overall objectives? That has been developed widely in the UK. Why in the UK? The UK has a discretionary planning system. It's different from a legalistic system, and it keeps a lot of things open. This is why this is an ideal model. Another point that sometimes I really get worried about, when we started talking about strategic environmental assessment, for example, in China 20 years ago, people were looking at the British literature because it's accessible, it's in English. The British planning system is one of the oddest in Europe. And a lot of people refer to the literature that describes and analyzes a system that is very different from their own, and they then use what they find as a conclusion in their own systems. It's dangerous. Most systems are legalistic, really. In terms of the legal tradition, it's discretionary, it's common law in the UK. In all other European countries, it's what? I forgot. Common law and... Yes, civil law. Oh, God. I've been talking for too long. That's always what happens then after 45 minutes. Civil law is a totally different tradition. Still people go, because it's accessible, they go to the British literature. Oh, this is how we do it. Yeah, but this comes from a totally different tradition. This is a typical Dutch example. This is sort of between Amsterdam, The Hague, and Rotterdam. It's an example from 20 years ago. I put that in that meeting we had in Brussels on the renewal of the SEA directive 2.5 weeks ago. There was a couple of Dutch people presenting a study on a strategic assessment for new housing in Leiden, a recent one. And I said, well, I've seen that somewhere before. And I asked the question, I said, no, but this is also an interesting one in terms of memory, institutional memory. That happened 20 years ago, and they went back and sort of almost did the same thing again 20 years later. It was bizarre. Anyway, so this was just about sort of finding new areas for that was a laugh. this is about new areas for housing between Amsterdam and The Hague. So it's very sort of broad brush at a very large scale. And it's very simple. It's sort of just scoring the different options that people have identified in terms of a range of aspects: livability, environment, sustainability, economy, and costs. This is an example you find in a lot of continental European countries. SEA, that is in effect a compilation of little project EIAs. This is a little town in Austria. It was an SEA looking at land use changes in that town for the land use plan. And what the land use plan actually does is it lists all little changes. And then the SEA, what it does is it has 50 of those matrices, and for each of the change, so in a way it looks at 50 projects in one go. And I mean, that's fine. But of course, what a lot of systems fail to do is they don't look at it cumulatively at the end. This is a typical example from Sweden, a typical sort of transport study, corridors, network improvements, actually intermodal, so we're considering both road and rail, and then coming up with sort of corridors of least resistance, if you would like to call it like that, environmental. This is another one from Germany. Again, an interesting example. I've followed one of these links over 25 years now because it's close to my hometown. 20 years ago, there was a study saying they were looking at all these links. The one option that really shouldn't come is build a new motorway between this and between this and this. It should be either one sort of here or then sort of another solution. And now 20 years later, what have the transport planners come up with? 2 new motorways. And this is at the moment controversially discussed, but anyway. And I'm saying this not because I say, oh, how dare you 20 years later to do something else. No, I don't. Things change. What I don't like is the fact that they never refer back to that. And if you're in a meeting and you say, but we had this study and they found that we shouldn't do this. Forget it. Well, it's not even forget about it. I don't know about this study. Well, let's leave it there. It's human nature to think wisely and act foolishly. It's great, this guy here, right? A metal ladder in a swimming pool, and he has a sort of a drill. If he falls off that ladder, I mean, okay, he may hurt himself falling, but I mean, there's a, well, he will probably die from electric shock. And then there is this guy here cleaning the windows, and he has this nice cabin that will protect him. He's actually standing on the bloody cabin. So it's human nature to think wisely and act foolishly, because all of what I'm saying looks, well, probably sounds very logical, but it's something to consider. And again, it's the way things are. And when we make decisions, we need to consider this. Learning, I leave that. We can talk about learning another time. Right. I wanted at least, I don't even know, is that correct? Yes, okay. A few words here in Icelandic. This is about a conference we are organizing. I wanted to put this in here, end of August, beginning of September in Lincoln. It's International Association for Impact Assessment. Water and Impact Assessment. We've had now 100 submissions, so it looks like hopefully we'll have 200, 250 participants for that. It's a special symposium. Some people missed, IIA has annual conferences this year. It was in Japan, so some people missed that. So that may be an alternative. Thank you.
Thomas, very enlightening talk. Við erum með svona 10 mínútur fyrir spurnir til Thomasar. Síðan verður tími í lok dagsins fyrir umræður og fyrir spurnir. Svo ef þið eru með spurningu sem beinist sem sagt til Thomasar og varðar fyrirlesturinn, þá gerðu svo vel. Well, I think já, gjör vel. Ég ætti kannski kynna ykkur, svo hvað heitið og hvað komið. Svo ja.
Thank you for an interesting lecture, even though you weren't lecturing. I would like to ask you in terms of alternatives. As we know, that's the basis of the SEA. But in
terms of what's reasonable alternative, and you talk about thinking outside the box, etc. That's not very easy. Have you any thoughts on how to approach the definition of reasonable?
Of reasonable?
Yeah, as a reasonable alternative.
Yeah, well, I mean, you obviously asked the question because reasonable, that's what, that's the directive, and obviously then probably what the Icelandic regulations say as well. Reasonable is what helps you solve your problem. And lawyers, once lawyers get involved, it becomes messy. It's sorry, this wasn't fun to lawyers. No, it becomes, no. In terms of making decisions that leave people, satisfied maybe, there should be a way of reaching this without sort of fighting each other, sort of in like a box fight almost. And this is what I mean when I say lawyers get involved, because lawyers can obviously be mediators, so I don't want to be but once you end up in court, that's not a good way, and it's usually not the way. Whoever, when you need to say reasonable alternatives, for example, a developer wanting to do something, that's not in a position a developer wants to be either, because time is money, and so reasonable is really to listen to what people who want to contribute have to say, and then really consider all of it. I don't know. One of the first things I asked when we met in Japan was, Scandinavian countries, of course, have a great tradition, sort of social democratic tradition, and a big interest in sort of consensus. And I asked, is that the same in Iceland? I was told, was I told no? I don't know. I don't believe it's possible to come up with consensus decision where every single person says yes, I can live with that. That's not possible. But I think the degree with which you give people really the feeling they are actually being heard makes all the difference. I mean, to give you one example, and I've been following two projects, as I said, closely near my hometown now. One was about wind farms, and one was about this new motorway. And I followed this whole process, and I sort of, because I worked for the ministry 20 years ago, and I thought, what has changed? So I contributed, I went to public meetings, and nothing has changed. The public meetings are used in a way to just kick off, sort of, have you considered this? Or is this really in line with what we should be doing? Oh yes, of course it's in line with what we should be doing. Shut up. So reasonable, I don't think reasonable has always something to do with what people really consider reasonable to start with. And I mean, to listen and deal with questions, deal with concerns, that's the important thing. When I'm developing this guidelines right now with a few others for the International Atomic Agency, there was a guy from Poland, and they're developing an atomic program for Poland at the moment. And he did an SCA for the whole country in terms of possible locations for nuclear power plants. And they came up with what could be called consensus locations. The company that was sort of enabled or in charge then for implementation overnight just changed the locations because they said, but it's cheaper to do it here. And I mean, needless to say that they will pay for this. They think it's cheaper, but it isn't. And I mean, when we talk about reasonable, as I say, I mean, reasonable, it is about taking people serious. I mean, strategic environmental assessment is an instrument, a democratic instrument that is giving people a voice, which doesn't mean the people's voice will make the decision, but it's about giving a voice. And the examples that I've seen is that people live with decisions more easily if they know the reasons for why a decision is taken and that their concerns have actually been taken on board. Now that sounds simple. It's not always the case. Things vary, of course. So reasonable, there is, and this is why, when you said reasonable, because there's a big legal debate, of course, in most countries now. What is reasonable? I'm not sure this is really going the right way. And SEA is stepping back, asking questions. What I've seen, for example, in the UK, the country I live and work in, we have had guidance now for 15 years, ever since the directive. Well, it was before the directive was implemented, so a bit less than 15 years, but anyway, it was released. At the beginning when they came out, there was a jump in quality. And that those guidance have never been adapted, have never been developed further. We know exactly what's going wrong. Nothing's done about it because people say, yeah, but we have those guidelines. And as long as we stick with them, it will avoid problems. Of course, it doesn't avoid problems. But that's not the spirit of SEA, and this is why I would really like to focus on that. And I mean, I've had people shouting at me for saying that. Saying this is unrealistic. I don't know if it's unrealistic. That's not necessarily what I've seen when this is applied in practice. Of course, in some countries, and I mean the country I was raised in and born in, Germany, is very legalistic, very hierarchical, and it's very difficult because people tell you to literally shut up when they have authority. And anyway. That was a very lengthy reply.
I think I will misuse my position, standing by the microphone.
Right.
I have a question about the fourth P that you presented. Yeah. That you should be focusing, including projects in the SEA. And as I recall, in the early days, the whole thing was about separating EIA and SEA. Yeah, a lot of people approached it by being like a big EIA. It's a little bit earlier and it's larger, but it's pretty much the same thing. And we were saying, no, forget everything you know about EIA. It's a new way of thinking. It's the spirit of SEA that you mentioned. But do you feel that we've gone too far in that way? Because some SEAs don't really apply to projects. They're never going to lead.
No. But
there are plans or programs that are not really meant to be the framework for a project.
I'm grateful that you say that. So, in reality, and my PhD supervisor was Norman Lee. He was one of the fathers of the EIA directive. And I was looking at one point at adaptive management. You probably have come across that. What's his name? He got a prize this year. I forgot his name now. As I say, I've been talking for too long. But anyway. And he was always quite critical. And I said, oh, you dismiss it. And he said, no, I don't dismiss it. But I think it's a brilliant concept. But I can't see that it's working in practice. Now, practice is based on preparing isolated policies, plans, and programs very often. So SEAs, individual SEAs are applied to that. But I say what you always need to do is you need to consider the whole system, no matter what you do. The individual SEAs and the individual EIA and some program SEAs look like EIAs and whatever. There will be methodological differences there, I don't disagree. But what was said at the beginning, and some people still quite aggressively advocate that now, we need to look at it totally separately. What it has led to is a separation of that tree. The connection between what we actually implement, what we actually do, and what we talk about all the time, where's the logic? It's missing very often, and that's what I'm saying. And I think this has been it's not been a mistake. People meant something else, but I mean, it's then interpreted in the way of, oh, we need to look at it totally differently, and we need to do something totally differently, and then, yeah. When you say that also, those people that do this totally differently, very often are totally different people from those that do this. So how do you connect it?
Final, síðasta chance, einhverjum spurningar?
It's exactly 1 hour now, I see here.
Yes, okay, thank you very much, Thomas.